I'm doing just a little bit of a review, not the entire thing, but a little bit of a review of what I feel like is the overwhelming or the overarching, I would say, call of this book. What Peter really wants us to see in this, and what he really wants us to do. And I've titled this "Life is Hard," because I feel like what he's really, a lot of what he's asking is he's asking us to do what's right when it's really going to be hard. Over and over, I feel like he's saying, this is going to be hard, and he's asking that we would keep going. And he's asking that instead of looking at life as like, oh, well, this is the reason I failed, or this was so hard, or instead I think he wants us to say, okay, if this is a test from God, how can I succeed in it? If God allowed me to struggle at this time, what would God want me to do in this time? And I think this is the basic premise of this book. The book started off in chapter 1, and he says that we've been born again to a living hope. And this is the joy that we have Jesus Christ. We're saved. We're on our way to heaven. We have this good thing to look forward to. But he doesn't waste much time. By the time he gets to verse 6, he says, "In this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you've been grieved by various trials." And he says that the tested genuineness of your faith. So right away, he doesn't waste a lot of time. He's like, yes, we have all this to be joyful about. However, for now, it might be really difficult. It might be hard. And then he says, so the tested genuineness of your faith. This is really the goal, and I think he doesn't really let up on this at all. He says that the tested genuineness of your faith, he says, more precious than gold. He says, though it is tested by fire. He says, may be found to result in the praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. And he says, so we have this faith. And he says it's going to be tested. It's not going to be easy. You know, if we're assuming that life is going to be just really smooth. He says there may be difficulty. He says this may be hard for us. And he says, but he wants us to come through. And he says our faith is going to, when we stand before God, he's going to be like, this came through like pure, like refined, like it came through shining. I was talking to kids in Sunday school this morning, and I was saying, it seems as though God almost, if we were to buy something, if we were to buy some expensive item, and we put it on a shelf in our house for like 5 years, and then we got it out and it just fell apart. And we're like, I guess I should have tested that when I bought it, right? But it's almost as though God puts us puts us to the fire and tests us, that he can see if we're legitimate right from the get-go, right out of the gate. So then there's also other sorts of testing in this. Some of these may be difficult testing, just hardship, and other of these may be like desires that are testing for us. He said in verse 16 of chapter 1, he says, as it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy. And he says, if you call upon him who judges impartially according to each one's deed, he says, conduct each one's deeds. He says, conduct yourself with fear throughout the time of your exile. And again, this idea of exile in this book is heavy. And he says it's almost like, all of us are waiting for heaven. We're all looking forward to that day. And we're rejoicing because we have heaven, but it's almost like we're all in exile right now. And as we go through this time, there's like things that we desire, things that we want, but we should conduct ourselves with fear throughout the time of this exile. We should make sure that we are walking the path, and there is going to be tests. There are going to be things that pull on us. They're going to be pulling us away from following God. And I think that we need to remember that we need to walk in holiness. And then he says here in chapter 2 in verse 11, he says, "Beloved, I urge you as sojourners, as exiles, to abstain from the passions of the flesh that wage war against your soul." And this is the other fight that we fight. We're constantly being pulled to do things that we shouldn't do. And there's constantly it's like we're under a test from God. That, are we going to obey God or are we not? And it's this battle that we continually fight, and we go on trying to do what is right. He says, keep your conduct among the Gentiles as honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. And again, there's going to be a lot of people who are going to give us a hard time in life as we go through life. But what are we going to do? Are we going to say, well, they're making fun of me, they're picking on me, they're teasing me, life is hard? He says, listen, when you're going to do what is right during it, so that when the people see you doing what is right in this life, he says they may glorify God. And on the day when God returns, they may be glorifying God. So there's again this idea that it may be difficult, it may be hard, but the thing that he will continually ask us to do is you do what is good and right in those moments, that the people around you may look and see that this is what is right. He goes through chapter 2, and he talks about obeying governments and authority and all of these things, and this is not always easy. This can be a very hard ask that we would do this. And then he says in verse 15, he says this. He says, for this is the will of God, that by doing good you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. And again, what are we supposed to do in all of this? In all of this world that is difficult and hard, and we're living amongst governments and things and authorities and all these different people who may just push us the wrong way, he says we are going to do what is good. And he says it's our good behavior that is going to put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. And I want to point out again, he says, for this is the will of God. And it's not going to be the last time he says that. And I think his point is, he wants us to know in life in general, what is our, he's like, this is our driving purpose and calling. You're thinking about your life and you're thinking about, okay, I'm going through all of this stuff, everything that comes at me, every struggle I face throughout life. He's like, this is the will of God. Do you say you know it? This is the will of God. You're going to do what is right through this trial, through this pressing through this battle of life that you're facing. And when you press through and do what is right, you will achieve the will of God. It's not necessarily an easy calling. It could be a very difficult thing. But this is what he has for you. And then he says this, he says in 16, he talks about living as servants, and 17 as honoring everyone, and then he says this in 18. He says, servants, be subject to your masters. And he says, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. And I think a lot of times we're just like, man, that's a hard ask. You know, it may be whoever we may be around. It may be groups that we're in. It could be people in our own church. Let's hope not. It could be our boss at work. It could be our coworkers. It could be the people in our house, in our family, in our homes, and whoever's around us. And he's talking about they're not going to be very good to you. They may not be kind to you. They may not treat you right. There's going to be people they're going to be in your environment, and they're not going to be good to you. And what are you going to do? You are going to do what is right. Forget how they behave. He says this is his ask. This is his goal. That it doesn't matter if they're good. You're not going to be making excuses here. You must do what is right. Throughout this difficult walk of life, you need to choose to do what is right. He says in verse 20, he says in verse 18, he says, for this is a gracious thing when mindful of God. One endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. Do you realize how clear he's making it? That God desires us to live in this life with people who are not being fair to us, yet you walk the line? Do you see how he says this is what God desires, and how God looks at this and says, that's what I'm talking about. Don't tell me about fair. Tell me about how you did what was right regardless, right? You see how he makes that point so clear. He says here, moving on, he says in verse 20, he says, for what credit is it when you sin and you are beaten for it and you endure? He says, but if when you do good and suffer for it, he says, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. He says, what's the point of suffering when you deserved it? But he's like, understand that God is looking at you people in a difficult situation in life, in hard times with hard people surrounding you. And he sees that you do what is right, even though it's not fair to you. That you don't make the who's fair and who's right call, but that you choose to do what is right in every situation. He says, And then he says in verse 21, listen to this. For to this you have been called. You understand? This is what you've been called to do. Like in case we're missing it. This is your high calling. That you would do what is right when they're not fair to you. He says this in the end of verse 21. He says, because Christ also suffered, leaving you an example that you might follow in his steps. He says, this Jesus Christ lived it out before us. And if you can't believe Peter, at least understand that Jesus Christ is supposed to be your example. And think about what he did. He suffered. He went through. He endured. When things weren't fair, people weren't fair to him, but yet he did what was right and make sure we follow in his steps. In verse 23, he says this, when he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but he continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. Jesus was like, you know what? I am going to do what is right. And Jesus, we didn't hear Jesus say, God, it's not fair. They're not fair to me. They're not good to me. We didn't hear Jesus say that. And God would have said, I know they're not good. I know that. I know that you know they're not fair. I know it's not fair. I know they're not good to you. I know. Do what is right. Do what is good. I understand this, right? And Jesus went through this very same thing, yet he did what was right. So in the beginning of chapter 3, he says this. He says, likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some of them do not obey the word, they may be won over without a word by the conduct of their wives, when they say you respectful and pure conduct. Now this one I don't understand. Are there husbands who are a pain in the butt? Am I missing something, ladies? Is there times when we're difficult? I don't know. Like, where is this coming from? Somehow he's reading into the idea that maybe we're a problem sometimes. I don't know. I can think of a couple times, right? What is your excuse, right? What are you supposed to do? Are you supposed to say, here's the problem. It's my husband. He's a problem. That's why I'm the way I am. Because it's not a fair situation, and no. He doesn't even give you a break on that, does he? Poor women, huh? But I will say this. I'm not trying to take away from it. We probably are really a pain in the butt, okay? But I would say probably in this day and age, it was maybe even harder on women versus men in that scenario. But I would say this goes both ways. If you're making excuses and you're saying the reason that I fall into sin or struggles or the reason that I don't endure right is because the wife that God gave me or this situation, I have somebody to blame, right? How'd that go for Adam? What happened in the beginning? What did Adam say? He says, God is the wife that you gave me, right? Was God pleased in that? No, right? Right? Men try to blame the women, right? But God is like, no, what is the point? We must do right regardless of our situation, right? It's not an excuse-making thing. This is what Peter is trying to drive home. He says it's not about making excuses. It's not about the test that you were put through. God's putting you through the test. It's about succeeding in the test. Quit trying to shift the blame of why you failed, right? Don't shift the blame of why you failed. He says this in 3:8. He says, finally, he says, all of you have unity of mind, sympathy, brotherly love. He says, a tender heart and a humble mind. And you're not going to be able to do this. You're not going to be able to fulfill the will of God if you're stubborn and angry and outlashing. And he says, no, you better have a tender heart and have a gentle and loving attitude. He says, this is going to be difficult. And he says, you're going to need to be a person in humility to get through this, to do what God is actually asking. You're going to need to do this. And then he says in verse 9 of 3, he says, do not repay evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but bless, right? He says, listen, you don't strike back with the same, you failed me, I fail you sort of situation, right? Over and over. How many times must Peter make this clear? He says, but when they treat you wrong, turn around and bless them, right? The opposite of what we would be inclined to do. This is what he's asking. And if you don't believe me, listen to this next part. For to this you have been called, right? He says it again and again and again, in case we're missing it. This is your calling in life. To be put with somebody who's going to be difficult and hard, and other people who are going to be difficult and hard, and situations that are going to be difficult and hard. But your high calling is to do what is right without blaming them, and to do what is right and realize that God understands the test that you're in right now. And it's about you and God doing what is right. This is your calling. And he says, to this you have been called that you may receive a blessing. This between you and God. You're on your way to eternity and you're like, God, I know that you know that this isn't fair to me, but I know that you have asked me to do what is right. And I will do what is right before you, regardless of making an excuse about the situation I happen to have fallen in right now. He says in verse 13 of chapter 3, he says this. He says, now who is there to harm you if you are zealous for doing what is good? Now you may say, who is there to harm me? I could be trampled. Are you kidding? If I just did what was good, I would be stepped on and walked on, and it wouldn't be fair, right? We would say, who is there to harm me if I just focus on doing what is good? But let me ask you again. If you focus on doing what God has asked you to do, what can go wrong, right? What can go wrong? If it's what God wants you to do, it can't go wrong. It may physically go wrong, but you will receive a blessing in heaven. You will pass the test that God is putting you through. And listen to what he says here in verse 14. He says, but even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, he says, you will be blessed. He says, have no fear of them, nor be troubled. Peter knows. He knows that you say, well, what could go wrong? And he's like, yeah, actually, I understand it could go wrong. But he's like, don't worry about it. You will have blessing from God. He says, don't fear people. Don't fear what's going to happen to yourself. He says, the biggest fear is failing the test that God has placed you in. The biggest fear is not following God's will. That supersedes all of the other little fears that you have. Don't let fear stop you from doing what is right. When you're put in the hard test and the hard time, don't say, I need to self-defend myself so that nothing goes wrong with me. He says, no. You got to break out of that and be like, I'll just do what is right, and I'm going to trust God. I'm going to trust God because it's self-preservation many times that stops us from doing what is right because we are defensive creatures by nature, right? And then he says, he continues on here, and he says in verse 17, he says, for it is better to suffer for doing good if it should be God's will than for doing evil. Do you realize how repetitive Peter is? Do you think he wants us to understand that it's better to go through some hard times and to have passed the test that God has laid before you than to try and preserve yourself and end up doing wrong against God? He says in verse 18, he says, for Christ also suffered, the righteous for the unrighteous. He says that he might bring us to God, having been put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit. And he says again, Jesus Christ suffered for us. We were undeserving sinners, and he suffered. He suffered unrighteously, unfairly, unfitted, unsuiting, and he suffered for us that he might bring us to God. And then he goes on a little bit more about it in verse 22, and he says, he is at the right hand of God with angels and authorities and powers having been subject to him. He is reaping the reward of doing what is right on this earth. When it wasn't easy, when it wasn't fair, Jesus Christ went through it, and now he is in glory with all of the glory for doing what was right. And I think, it is our example that we are to follow. He says here in the beginning of chapter 4, he says this. He says, since therefore God suffered in the flesh, arm yourself with the same mindset. And I think, again, he wants us to understand that we are supposed to do as Jesus did. And he wants us to think the way that he did, and he doesn't want us to miss this point. And then he says this if I can find my place here. He says this in verse 12 of chapter 4. He says, beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. And, as he's winding this down, he lets us know. He says, beloved, when you accept Jesus Christ, don't be surprised when life goes hard and when things go wrong. He says, don't be surprised when there are fiery trials that come upon you to test you. He says, as though something strange were happening to you. Don't think to yourself like, oh, everything has gone wrong. He says, think to yourself, God is putting me through a difficult test. God is putting me through something difficult that I need to conquer and overcome. He says in verse 13, he says, but rejoice insofar as you share in Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice when his glory is revealed. He says that we need to think about it in the way that God sent us a test. And we are going to pass and fail based on how we react to that test. Not about how we may think, oh, well, it wasn't a fair test, or God understands why I really messed up because I had every excuse in the world, right? He says, no, you need to understand that God has allowed you to be tested, that you may pass the test and be glorified with him in eternity, instead of thinking to yourself that something must be wrong, something must be broken in the system. And as we come to an end here, I'm not even going to go through all of the things in chapter 5 that he talked about testing, testing coming upon the household of God and all of these things. We have just gone through it, but it goes on and on. But as we come to an end of this book and close this out, Peter had just been talking about how the devil was our adversary, and he was seeking to destroy us. And in verse 9, he says of chapter 5, he says, resist him and stand, he says, knowing that the same kinds of sufferings are being experienced by your brotherhood throughout the world. He says, this isn't just, I'm not just talking to a little church in Asia Minor where they're going through suffering, they're running from Rome, they're exiles. He's like, this is a thing in the world, all of the world. You're being tested. Christianity is being put to the test. People are being tested to see if they will stand firm for God or if they will run. People are being tested to see if they will hold to holiness and what is right, or if they'll cast blame and excuses and not follow God. And he says this here in closing here. He says in verse 10, he says, after you have suffered a little while, he says, the God of all grace, he says, he will himself restore, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. And I think, as we go through life and we're thinking how difficult it may be and how hard it may be, all the struggles that we go through, God himself is waiting to come in. And it may be 50, 70 years. I don't know. But God is waiting. And God himself is going to come down. And he's going to pick you up and he's going to say, I am here to comfort you. I am here to establish you. I am here to strengthen and raise you up when you have done what is right. God is waiting to restore you. And I think of this, I think it's probably much how Jesus gave us an example in his suffering. Remember when he was tempted by Satan and he fasted and he went through this hard time showing that we can do it, as at least not in perfection, but we can follow his example. And after his testing, God sent angels to strengthen him and restore him. But this time, God says, I will come myself, and I will pick you up, and I will restore you, and I will give you all that you've wanted, right? And he says that he's going to do this. And in closing, he says this. He says, by Silvanus, a faithful brother, as I regard him, I have written to you briefly, exhorting you, declaring that this is the true grace of God. He says, stand firm in it. And he says, so Silvanus has carried this letter to the church here. And he says, she who is in Babylon, likewise chosen, sends you greetings. And he says, as my son Mark as well. And he says, greet one another with a kiss of love. He says, peace to all of you who are in Christ. And the end. But as we're thinking about this, and as we're thinking about all that Peter's told us and everything that he's emphasized in this book, I just think, who and what is testing your life today? What is making your life difficult? What is making it hard? And are you doing what is right? Are you committed to what is right, or are you committed to excuses? Right? Are you committed to obeying God in difficulty? And are you seeing each thing as something where, I have heard Christians themselves say, run. It's not fair It's not fair that that's an unfair situation. And I'm not saying there's not times for that, but I'm just saying, in general, do we realize what Peter is saying? Peter is saying, you know what? I want you to do what is right when they're not fair to you. And I want you to be a shining light, an example in this world for the world to look at. And I want God to be able to come down and be like, you did what was right when I let the testing come upon you. And you showed your truth, and you showed your strength, and you stood firm in me. That's what I wanted when I brought this test into your life. That's what I wanted to see, and you have done it. And I'm here to strengthen and encourage and restore you and lift you up, right? And so maybe we should think about that a little bit in our lives. I think it's something that's far, far underthought about. That maybe, and again, almost this whole book, Peter just rammed that idea home so that we wouldn't miss it. So let's not miss it, right? Let's not miss what he's put before us, and whatever struggle it may be in your life right now, whatever challenge it may be. I hope you're ready to commit to God and be like, instead of saying this is why I fail, I'm going to say I am going to conquer in spite of, right? I'm going to do what is right in spite of the heavy test that is upon me right now, and I just hope that we can do that. So let's go ahead and close in a word of prayer this morning. Our God and Father, I just pray that you would just help us to understand that you know many times that things are not fair to us, and many times you know that we're in situations that are difficult, and we would love to rattle off excuses for why we have disobeyed you, and why we've walked away from holiness, and why we have lashed out and been unkind, and we would love to give reasons and things of this nature. But Lord, I just ask that you would help us to realize what this letter's been teaching us, that you have allowed testing at times to come into our lives, that we may overcome, that we may be shown our true colors, that when fire is put to us, we are still strong in you, that we will do what is right, Lord. And I just pray that you'll just help us to see difficulty as a opportunity to show that we are truly faithful unto you, though fire is put to us, Lord. And I just pray that you'll just help us to grow in this strength and this knowledge, that we would be ready for you at the revelation of Jesus Christ, that we would be in joy at that moment when we are glorified with you because we have stood with you, Lord. And I just pray this in your Son's name. Amen.